Good morning. So my name is Aaron Manka, and I'm here today to talk to you about our review of NSF's responsible conduct of research policy and how universities have responded in implementing that. So because I work for the government, I have to disclose that the opinions expressed here today will be my own and don't represent those of NSF. So the National Science Foundation is a federal agency that funds all areas of basic research and engineering. And the Office of Inspector General is an oversight office that looks at NSF programs and activities. So in 2007, Congress passed the America Competes Act, and Dr. Phillips just talked about that a little bit, that laid out requirements for NSF to have a policy that required universities to provide RCR training. The House report didn't get a lot of attention, but it had some interesting language in there that said it recognized that Congress recognized that it had not defined what appropriate training was and expected NSF to do so and to develop and provide written guidelines and/or templates for the universities to follow so that compliance can be verified by all parties. So when NSF implemented its requirement 3 years later, it didn't actually do that. What it did was pass that on to universities and tell them that they should provide appropriate training to students who are supported by their grants. So the original language had participated, NSF made that supported, which it defined as those people, undergrads, grads, or postdocs, who are directly funded by the grant. In lieu of guidance and templates, NSF recommended that institutions conduct a risk assessment to determine for themselves who was at risk, what kind of training would address that risk, and the content and all that should be part of that risk assessment. So Dr. Phillips' research statement is actually the same one that we used. Given that NSF provided no guidance and no templates, we were curious as to how institutions would implement NSF's requirement to provide appropriate RCR training for undergrads, grads, and postdocs. We're also aware that NSF and NIH took different approaches to this problem. NSF left it completely up to universities without guidance. NIH is fairly specific in what it expects from a satisfactory or adequate RCR training program. So what we did was we asked 53 institutions to provide us with their RCR training plans, a list of all the trainees, and we wanted interviews with senior administrators, the RCR coordinators, and people who had completed the training at that institution. So you can see when we initially contacted institutions, there were 53 of them. 5 of those were community colleges, and none of those had RCR plans. And in talking with them, what they told us was that NSF's requirement applies to institutions that are getting grants to conduct research, which is actually what NSF's requirement is, and that their grants were for education, and so therefore it was not applicable to them. And given that that's what NSF's policy states, we agreed, and so we removed them from our sample. So that left us with 48 institutions, 11 of which did not have plans when we initially contacted them. And you can see most of those were in what we categorized as small institutions, that is, institutions with 5,000 or less students. Medium is 5 to 15, and larger than 15, greater than 15 are the large universities. All right, so that left us with a compliance rate of 77%. Subsequently, 8 out of those 11 institutions that did not have a plan did ultimately develop a plan, so we kind of call a second chance compliance of 94%, but the real number is 77% didn't have a plan when we contacted them. So we needed some way to characterize institutions and what we were seeing in their plans and from talking with people. So we came up with a compliance-oriented university versus an education-oriented university, and of course there's hybrids, some that do some of both. So we looked at what is required, right? So lots of universities have options out there, but we wanted to focus on what is required. So we looked at 2 factors: who is required to be trained and the format of that training. Is there some kind of interactive requirement, or can the training be completed entirely online? So we found that roughly 64% of the universities fit into compliance. That means they train only those students who are directly supported by the NSF grant, and they allow those students to complete the online training, to complete the RCR training entirely online. The hybrid compliance are those universities that still allow the training to be completed online, but train more than those minimally required. So they might train those participating in the research, or even those who don't have support from a funding agency. And then in the hybrid educational, it's those universities that train the minimum students, but they require some interactive component to the RCR training. And then finally, educational, those universities that require training of more than the students just supported by the grant, and they require some type of interactive training as part of the RCR education course. So if you look across the top, you can see that 73% of the universities, institutions in our sample allow RCR training online to completion of the RCR training online only. If you look down the first column, you'll see that 73% of the universities only require training of those directly supported by the NSF grant. So in our interviews with the participants of the training, those that answered, roughly 65% of those said that they preferred interactive training because that gave them the opportunity to ask questions and they could talk about case studies and things like that. So one university that we talked with did an interesting experiment. So they gave students the option of taking online-only training or interactive training, and they tracked the results. And they found that only 5% of the people given the option to take a course actually did so. So 95% of the people, if you give them the chance to take online-only training, the convenience of that outweighs everything else, and that's what they choose, or at least at that one university, that's what they did. So we hadn't originally looked at differentiated training, but we saw Phillips and Group's paper, so we looked at that. So we saw that roughly 52% of the institutions in our sample differentiated based on education level, and 72% differentiated based on discipline. And that was primarily in offering either more modules. In the case of education level, typically undergraduates had to take a smaller number of modules in the online training. And in the discipline-based, some departments required different modules than other departments in their online training. Also in the discipline-based differentiation, some departments had a faculty member who incorporated some RCR elements in a course. So because NSF had not defined what appropriate training is, we had no way of saying which universities were providing adequate training or not. There's no standard, so universities can't be held to a standard, so we can't make any statements about that. But we did find that universities were not conducting a risk analysis as suggested by NSF to determine who should take what training when, of what content, and how often. So we did see some examples of training that may be questionable. For example, some universities just had generic lab safety, humans or animal subject training, or data IT management training constitute their RCR training. Some institutions told us that RCR training was incorporated into the curriculum, but they couldn't identify any particular RCR elements in any particular courses. Some universities, generally the smaller universities that had fewer NSF grants, had the PI lead the training, but the PI didn't get any guidance from the university. So depending on which PI had which grants, the students were getting training according to whatever the PI thought was important. And finally, we did see one place that the entirety of their RCR training was to require participants to read a handout. We also saw what we think are best practices. So one really good example we thought was stress management. So we've seen several talks at this conference have indicated that there's a lot of pressure, a lot of stress out there on people, pressure to get data, pressure to publish, pressure to go to conferences, lots of pressure. So one university incorporated stress management into its curriculum for RCR training, and they said that quickly became the #1 requested element of all of their RCR training. And when we mentioned this to other universities, they immediately jumped on that as well, so we thought that was a really good thing that happened. So some universities required RCR training of all graduate students, and generally those are the bigger, very high and sensitive research places, have a lot of resources, money to dump into their programs. They can require all graduate students to take the RCR training. In fact, one university, there was a mention of incorporating RCR training for, the humanities. They had got everybody but the humanities on board, and they were struggling to come up with what would appropriate training look like for students in the humanities. So some universities do require periodic training on the order of 3 years or more. Not a lot, but a couple did. This was really interesting. We thought it was important, the few places we saw that told participants why RCR training was important. The majority of the trainees we interviewed, undergrads, grads, and postdocs, their response when we asked them why is RCR training important is because the NSF requires it, and the university requires it, so we have to take it. That doesn't really, at least in my opinion, doesn't really impart the importance of why we're even doing this. Why is training required? It's not a checkbox, but unless somebody tells, students why this is important, how this is supposed to help you in your career, the message they come away with is they're taking the training to satisfy a federal agency requirement. And then some universities require students to take the training before they start work on the NSF-funded project. We thought that was a great idea. We did interview some trainees who had completed their work on an NSF project, generally undergrads, and they didn't take the training until after their work was already completely done on the project. So our conclusions, we saw that most institutions had a plan, again 77%. Most had a designated person, and most were able to do the proper tracking. That is, ensure that participants who were supposed to take the training, in fact, did take the training. We saw that without definition or guidance, there's no standards, compliance can't be verified. So institutions generally were more compliance-focused than education-focused in that they allowed the training to be completed online. There was no requirement for interactive training. In our interviews with the senior administrators in particular, and also some RCR administrators, is really where the differences between NSF and NIH policies were discussed. And I guess it's not surprising that most institutions prefer the NSF approach, which is let them control what the agenda is going to be, what the format of the training is. They like that flexibility, but they really liked the NIH guidance. They wanted guidance from NSF. They want to have some idea of what would constitute adequate training rather than some nebulous risk assessment. And so again, the online versus education focused, and that was because of the prevalence of online training. And we saw that PIs were rarely involved. Oh, I didn't mention that in the last one. So, yeah, roughly 15% of the institutions that were in our sample had the PI involved in the RCR training. And when we interviewed the students, that was really important because they said if it's important enough for my advisor or for my faculty to be involved, I take this more seriously. And it also illustrates a big disconnect with what I see in when I'm wearing my other hat in my job, is to investigate allegations of research misconduct. So NSF makes 95% of its plagiarism findings against faculty, PIs, right? Yet PIs, faculty, are completely exempt from the RCR training. So there's a big disconnect there. So we're seeing plagiarism from the faculty, but it's not being addressed. All right, so thank you for your time.
So we have time for really 2 questions now, please.
I have a quick question, and I won't ask questions the next 2 sessions. Risk assessment, not needs assessment. What's the risk? What are we afraid of? Misconduct? Is that the reason that NSF is
Well, so I can't speak for NSF on why it decided to do that, but I assume that, yes, that without some kind of training, that students are at risk of committing ethical lapses.
And I don't
And
know that
s-
we have evidence of that.
And
But it's interesting that that also shows a compliance mentality rather than an education mentality. If we did a needs assessment, we'd want to know what the students need to learn to be good scientists, not just not to cheat. I had not seen that before, or not thought about it before, that a risk assessment, that may actually set the stage for a particular way of seeing the problem.
it may, but as we found, most institutions, all of them in fact, weren't doing that. So most of them just went to, online training from the various places, city or Epigem, supplemented by some adjustments to the curriculum. So that may, in fact, be an impression that was given, but if that's the case, it wasn't, I can't say, but universities weren't doing the risk assessment.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Susan O'Brien, University of Queensland. I'm interested in whether you have any, I guess, anecdotal observations, having done a survey of online training versus face-to-face interactive training, compliance versus a more educative approach, and combined with your knowledge in your role. What is your personal view of the best form of training that we should be offering in our institutions?
Well, I think that, as Dr. Phillips said, at least City wasn't originally designed to be a standalone training. So students did find, when we interviewed them and we asked them their preferences, so students liked the online training mostly for the convenience, but also what they told us was they thought that it brought commonality to the subject. So it introduced a set of vocabulary that they may or may not have known. But by having everybody take that same course, everybody shared that vocabulary so that in future discussions, they could share ideas along those same lines. But I do think one of the larger complaints about that was that the lack of case studies and the lack of an ability to discuss those case studies was really the number one complaint about that. So I would think that based mostly on what we heard from the participants is that, online training can be a good foundation to introduce common vocabulary, but that there should be some interactive discussion using case studies as examples and allow debate and discussion about that.
Okay, thank you.
Aaron, for countries, again, because this is a World Conference, I think we have some representatives here from other institutions who, again, probably are implementing some actions. Do you think that for agencies in other countries, it is worth starting by compliance or making recommendations for training, a more education-oriented approach for institutions? In your experience, do you think that compliance should come first and then a more education-oriented approach? What advice do you give?
I think I would just repeat. So I think that the online only, so I guess the compliance focus is good, is viewed as kind of setting the table, introducing common vocabulary. But I do think, some discussion, is important.
Yeah, because some people say that for countries which are just starting RCR initiatives, requirements are not that good because you do not have the people, do not have the structure, the material. So, and they say that the only way that they have to solve this problem is not establishing requirements, but asking people to do something, the way.
Yeah, and we saw that too. So one university, the topic of budgets has come up, gave $0. So even City was too expensive for them. So they looked for free online training, and they asked professors to volunteer to talk to students. So, I don't know that that's an international, that's a problem with a lot of places.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk.